The sea was black that night, a mirror of oil and shadow. August 1943. Somewhere in the Solomon Islands, a storm of distant gunfire echoed from the horizon, faint but relentless. Beneath the clouds, a line of small silhouettes cut across the waves. Wooden hulls, no heavier than fishing boats, yet armed like predators. Their engines, 3 roaring Packards apiece, sent white foam streaming behind them. Inside the cramped cabins, young American sailors gripped throttles and scanned the darkness ahead. Radar barely existed here. Navigation came from instinct, moonlight, and courage. In these fragile boats, one hit meant fire, and fire meant death. But still, they charged forward, toward a convoy of Japanese destroyers that outweighed them 100 to 1. A single flare split the night sky. The ocean lit up like day. Torpedoes splashed into the black water, streaking toward their targets. In that instant, the Imperial Navy learned something new. America's deadliest hunters weren't its biggest ships. They were its smallest. The question lingered in the smoke and spray. Where did these boats come from? And how did they shock Japan's mighty fleet? The idea of a fast, lightly built torpedo craft was not new. European navies had experimented with them since the First World War. Small vessels designed to strike larger ships under cover of darkness and speed. But, for the United States, a nation defined by heavy industry and blue water strategy, such boats had always seemed unimportant. The U.S. Navy believed in battleships and carriers, not in wooden craft barely 70 feet long. That mindset began to shift in the 1930s. As tensions rose in both Europe and the Pacific, naval thinkers quietly revisited an old question. Could small, fast craft defend distant coastlines where big ships could not? In 1938, the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair invited private shipyards to design experimental motor torpedo boats, later known simply as PT boats. The first prototypes came from small builders. Higgins Industries of New Orleans, Electric Boat Company in Groton, and the tiny Miami Shipbuilding Corporation. They competed in a series of brutal sea trials off Rhode Island in 1940. Some boats fell apart in the waves. Others caught fire. But one design impressed the evaluators, a narrow wooden hull capable of topping 40 knots while carrying 4 deadly torpedoes. These boats were little more than wooden shells, layered mahogany planks over a lightweight frame. Their strength derived from flexibility rather than armor. Each was powered by 3 12-cylinder Packard gasoline engines, the same type used in racing boats, capable of producing over 200 horsepower each. They burned fuel like aircraft, gallons per minute. But that was the price of speed. A typical PT boat, about 80 feet long and 40 tons in weight, carried 4 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes, twin 50-caliber machine guns, and eventually a 20mm Oerlikon cannon on the stern. Some later versions even mounted captured Japanese weapons or improvised rocket launchers. They were the definition of ingenuity, part factory design, part sailor's invention. By 1941, as the world slid toward total war, the U.S. Navy's skepticism began to waver. Reports from Europe told of British MTBs, motor torpedo boats, ambushing Axis shipping in the Channel. They struck fast, disappeared faster, and cost almost nothing compared to destroyers. The idea appealed to American planners faced with defending vast island chains and narrow coasts. In March 1941, the Navy placed its first significant orders. Dozens of boats would soon roll out of Higgins's New Orleans yards and Elko's New Jersey plant. The Navy created new squadrons, motor torpedo boat squadrons, or RONs, each consisting of 12 boats, commanded by young lieutenants barely out of Annapolis. They were not glamorous assignments. The PT service attracted those who sought adventure more than promotion, men who valued independence and risk. They were mechanics, engineers, and daredevils in equal measure. Among them was a young lieutenant named John F. Kennedy, who would later command PT-109, but that story was still years away. Early training took place at Melville, Rhode Island, a wind-battered base where new crews learned to navigate by compass, fight by instinct, and maintain engines that constantly threatened to overheat or explode. Maintenance was relentless. Fuel leaks and salt corrosion were daily battles. But morale was high. The men believed in their mission, to prove that speed and surprise could stand against steel and armor. Behind them stood a growing web of quiet collaborators. The U.S. Coast Guard assisted in patrol doctrine. The Office of Naval Intelligence studied how these boats could support commando raids and sabotage operations. Even the newly formed OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency, saw their potential for infiltration and covert delivery. By mid-1941, the U.S. had accepted more than 100 PT boats into service. Most sat idle, awaiting deployment orders. Few yet understood where they would be used, or how. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan struck Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned, carriers fled, and suddenly, the United States Navy faced a Pacific Ocean it no longer controlled. Big ships were scarce, speed was survival, and the small, fast boats that had once been an experiment would soon become the Navy's only hunters still able to strike back. The PCQ, wooden prototypes that had raced off Rhode Island, were about to enter a very different ocean, one filled with fire, steel, and shadows. When the smoke of Pearl Harbor cleared, America's Pacific Fleet lay crippled. 6 battleships were sunk or burning, airfields destroyed, and the Imperial Japanese Navy reigned across half the Pacific. For months, Japan advanced unchecked through the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the South Pacific. The U.S. Navy, stunned and short of capital ships, searched desperately for anything that could fight back. And so, the small wooden boats, once dismissed as toys, were thrust into a war they were never designed for. In early 1942, the first PT squadrons were rushed to the Philippines. Among them was Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, commanded by Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley. His orders were nearly impossible: harass the advancing Japanese fleet and protect retreating American forces around Bataan and Corregidor. Bulkeley's boats were barely seaworthy, underpowered, underarmed, and plagued by mechanical failure. Yet, in the narrow channels of the Philippines, they found their element. At night, the PTs darted between islands, laying ambushes against Japanese barges and patrol craft. They struck in seconds and vanished into darkness before the enemy could respond. Their greatest moment came in March 1942, when Bulkeley's small flotilla carried General Douglas MacArthur and his staff from Corregidor through enemy waters, a daring 560-mile escape to Mindanao that electrified the American press. The Mosquito Fleet, as journalists called them, had given the nation its first naval heroics after Pearl Harbor. But the victory was symbolic. Within weeks, the Philippines fell. The surviving PTs were scuttled or destroyed. Yet, their legend had begun. As the war spread, new PT squadrons deployed to every contested shore, from the Aleutian Islands to the jungled lagoons of the Solomons. The Navy built hundreds more, refined the designs, and introduced newer, faster models like the Elco 80-foot and Higgins 78-foot classes. By 1943, over 500 were in production. The Pacific was their true battleground, a labyrinth of coral reefs, narrow straits, and hostile coastlines where battleships couldn't maneuver. Japanese destroyers and troop transports prowled these waters at night, moving reinforcements between island bases. Air cover was rare, radar unreliable, the perfect hunting ground for something small, fast, and invisible. Operating in groups of 2 or 3, the PT boats would wait until nightfall, running silently on 1 or 2 engines. Radar, when available, was crude but invaluable. allowing them to detect enemy ships at several miles. Once contact was made, they accelerated to full power, closed within a few thousand yards, and fired their torpedoes before vanishing back into the blackness. The risks were immense. A single burst of enemy gunfire could tear through the wooden hull like paper. Many PTs were destroyed without leaving a trace. Yet the crews persisted, driven by a mixture of pride and vengeance. The Japanese Navy, accustomed to fighting large ships, found these encounters maddening. Radar was limited aboard many of their vessels, and PT boats were nearly invisible against the dark sea. Reports began to surface of phantom American craft, attackers that appeared from nowhere, struck and disappeared before the gunners could aim. By mid-1943, these boats were serving not only as attackers, but as scouts, rescuers, and supply runners. They delivered Marines to enemy shores, extracted downed pilots, and ferried spies and commandos under cover of night. Their versatility transformed them from experimental weapons into a backbone of America's coastal warfare. The Japanese soon realized the psychological impact was as dangerous as the physical. Every splash in the night, every distant engine noise could mean a torpedo incoming. Destroyer captains began to zigzag nervously through calm seas, wasting fuel and sleep. In a war dominated by steel giants, these fragile boats had become ghosts of the Pacific, small enough to hide in coves, fast enough to outpace pursuit, and deadly enough to earn Japan's respect. By late 1943, PT squadrons dotted every major island chain. From Tulagi and Guadalcanal to the coast of New Guinea, they stalked convoys, patrolled in darkness, and struck at supply lines that fed the Japanese war machine. They were no longer an experiment. They were a fleet, America's secret fleet. And within that fleet lay many stories of men, machines, and moments that changed how wars at sea would be fought forever. They were not the polished officers of carrier decks or the stern admirals of battleships. PT crews were volunteers, restless, daring, often too young to know fear. Most were in their early 20s, some barely old enough to shave. They came from fishing towns, engineering schools, and small boat clubs across America. What drew them wasn't duty alone. It was the promise of speed, independence, and adventure. Training at Melville, Rhode Island, was relentless. Recruits learned to navigate by starlight, fire torpedoes without radar, and maintain 3 roaring Packard engines in pitch darkness. Living quarters were cramped, 20 men packed into a space smaller than a city bus. Heat, fumes, and vibration were constant companions. Food spoiled quickly. Sleep was brief and broken, yet morale remained high. They gave their boats names, often painted in rough white letters on the hull. Thunderbolt, Devilfish, Hooligan's Navy. To them, these wooden vessels were not just machines, but living things, unpredictable, temperamental, and alive. When not on patrol, they played cards, swapped stories, or tinkered endlessly with engines and guns. They were mechanics as much as sailors, every man expected to fix, steer, or fight when needed. In battle, there was no rank, only instinct and trust. In later years, one sailor would recall, "We weren't fighting for medals. We were fighting to keep each other alive." The human bond aboard these boats was unlike anything else in the Navy. A brotherhood forged not by ceremony, but by survival. If the PT boat had one true advantage, it was the night. Japanese ships dominated daylight waters with superior firepower and air cover. But when darkness fell, the balance shifted. The PTs, small, low, and nearly invisible, became predators. A typical attack began hours before midnight. The boats idled silently offshore, their engines muffled to a hum. The moon determined everything. Too bright, and they postponed. Too dark, and navigation became deadly. When the conditions aligned, they advanced in groups of 2 or 3. Radar, if fitted, gave the first whisper of contact, a faint blip that meant a Japanese convoy or destroyer was near. Closing in to 2,500 or 2,000 yards, the PTs lined up their targets, fired their torpedoes, and veered away at full speed. Within seconds, tracer rounds lit the sky, and the sea exploded in geysers of white water. Accuracy was often poor. Early torpedoes ran too deep, and the boat's unstable platforms made aiming nearly impossible. But when they hit, the results were devastating. A single Mark 8 torpedo could break a destroyer's back or ignite fuel-laden transports in seconds. Ambushes demanded discipline. Every man aboard had to know his task. Helmsman steady, gunners silent until discovery. Engineer ready to push the throttles wide when the order came. There was no room for hesitation. They called it hit and vanish. In practice, it meant threading through coral reefs and minefields under fire, navigating by instinct and the faint outline of the coast. The Japanese response was brutal. Searchlights scoured the sea. Shells rained down. But more often than not, the PTs were gone before the enemy could lock on. Over time, the crews turned their tactics into an art form, learning to approach with the wind, using phosphorescent wakes as guides, even timing attacks with tropical squalls to mask their approach. Their greatest ally was unpredictability. One commander described it best. "We didn't fight their navy, we haunted it." From a tactical standpoint, the PTs represented a radical break from naval orthodoxy. The traditional Navy prized formations, radio control, and heavy guns. PT doctrine rejected all of it. Instead, commanders emphasized autonomy and initiative. Each boat captain operated almost independently, guided by mission objectives, but trusted to decide when and how to strike. Orders were brief, often just a position and a target description. Once at sea, communication was minimal. Lights off, radios silent, every boat alone in the dark. This demanded extraordinary self-reliance. The Navy called them motor torpedo boats, but their crews called themselves the Mosquito Fleet. Small, fast, and impossible to swat. Doctrine evolved through trial and error. Early in the war, PTs attempted open water attacks against destroyers, with heavy losses. Later, they shifted to guerrilla-style operations, ambushing supply barges, interdicting landing forces, and striking at vulnerable coastal transports. These missions achieved far greater success. The boats also proved invaluable as scouts and escorts for amphibious landings. They mapped reefs, relayed intelligence, and drew enemy fire away from transports. Their adaptability impressed senior commanders, even those who once doubted them. Yet, this independence came at a cost. Many PT squadrons operated with minimal coordination or support. Resupply was inconsistent, and maintenance was often improvised with local materials. Every mission risked breakdowns or running out of fuel miles from safety. Still, they endured. The Mosquito Fleet had found its doctrine: strike at night, strike fast, and never stay still. But for all their courage and cunning, it was technology, the engines, the torpedoes, and the crude radar, that defined their limits and potential. And above them all stood commanders who believed small boats could do what battleships could not. At the heart of every PT boat roared 3 Packard 4M 2500 engines, aviation-derived, 12-cylinder monsters capable of pushing the boats past 45 knots. Each engine burned aviation-grade gasoline, volatile and unforgiving. A stray spark could turn a PT into a floating inferno. They were miracles of engineering and nightmares to maintain. Crews spent hours tuning carburetors, cleaning filters, and praying the cooling system wouldn't fail in tropical heat. When the throttles opened, the noise was deafening. A raw, physical force that vibrated through the hull. Fuel consumption was staggering. A single night patrol could burn over 3,000 gallons, forcing the boats to rely on floating fuel depots or captured drums. In rough seas, engines stalled or flooded, forcing crews to tear down machinery mid-battle. But when everything worked, the result was breathtaking. These wooden hulls, no armor, no steel, could outrun nearly anything afloat. They closed in on destroyers, loosed torpedoes, and vanished into darkness before the enemy could react. Packard engineers continued refining the design throughout the war, increasing reliability, improving exhaust mufflers, and giving crews more control over power output. Every small upgrade meant survival. The PT's speed became its greatest weapon, its one shield in an ocean of firepower. They were not tanks or cruisers. They were racers with guns, and their engines gave America's smallest fleet the agility to shock an empire. The PT boat's most distinctive feature, its torpedoes, was both its pride and frustration. Early models carried the Mark 8, a holdover from World War I. Long and heavy, it was designed for larger ships, not fragile wooden craft. Fired from cumbersome launch tubes, it was difficult to aim accurately and often ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath targets. By 1943, the Navy introduced roll-off racks that allowed faster firing and easier reloading. Later, the smaller and more reliable Mark 13 aerial torpedo, originally built for aircraft, became standard. It fit the PT's hit-and-run tactics perfectly. Armament evolved constantly. Crews mounted whatever weapons they could find: 20mm cannons, 37mm anti-tank guns, even salvaged Japanese machine guns. Some PTs bristled with so much firepower they looked like floating gun platforms. Innovation was born from necessity. Radar was another quiet revolution. The early SO radar sets, primitive and bulky, gave PTs an enormous advantage. They could detect Japanese convoys long before visual contact. On moonless nights, this meant the difference between ambush and annihilation. As the war progressed, radar-guided tactics grew sharper. PTs would operate in coordinated packs, sharing targets over radio, guiding one another toward enemy ships like hunters circling prey. The combination of speed, radar, and improved torpedoes transformed the PT boat from an experiment into a precision weapon. It wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but in the dark waters of the Pacific, it was often the first to strike. Leadership shaped the PT story as much as technology. Commanders like Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, John Bulkeley, and later Lieutenant John F. Kennedy embodied a new kind of naval officer: aggressive, improvisational, unbound by traditional doctrine. They led from the front. In battle, they were often the first to engage and the last to retreat. Their courage inspired their crews and redefined how small units could wage naval war. At higher levels, admirals debated the boat's true value. Critics argued that PTs sank few major ships and drained resources better spent on destroyers. Supporters countered that their psychological and tactical impact was immense, forcing Japan to divert destroyers, supply barges, and aircraft to defend against them. The Japanese Navy, initially dismissive, soon adapted. They armed transports with heavier guns and developed faster escort vessels. Reports circulated of new tactics, using decoy convoys to lure PTs into traps. Yet the Americans adjusted just as quickly. Japanese intelligence nicknamed them devil boats. Captured diaries revealed frustration and fear among sailors forced to patrol at night. The uncertainty wore on morale. Every shadow on the horizon a possible ambush. Every flare a prelude to death. In this invisible duel, both sides evolved. The PTs grew deadlier, the Japanese warier. Neither fully understood the other's strength until it was too late. For the Americans, the lesson was clear. Naval warfare no longer belonged solely to giants of steel. The age of mobility and speed had begun. And soon, across the islands of the Pacific, that speed would collide with destiny in a series of violent encounters that proved just how much damage a handful of wooden boats could do. The Solomon Islands, August 1st, 1943. The night was windless, a perfect mirror of black water stretching toward Kolombangara. PT Squadron 9 had orders to intercept a Japanese supply convoy, one of the infamous Tokyo Express runs, ferrying men and ammunition through narrow channels. The enemy ships were larger, faster, and bristling with guns. But they would be vulnerable while unloading. Among the boats prowling the darkness was PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant J.G. John F. Kennedy. His mission was simple in words, deadly in execution: block the Japanese retreat. The American boats spread into ambush positions, throttled low, engines muffled. Radar picked up faint contacts moving fast. Destroyers running dark, hugging the coast. The PTs turned toward them, their wakes glowing faintly in phosphorescent water. The first salvo of torpedoes raced out, silent streaks beneath the surface. Moments later, the sea erupted with the thunder of Japanese return fire. Kennedy's boat held position, waiting to strike again. Then, out of the night, disaster appeared. The destroyer Amagiri, running at 30 knots, sliced through the darkness, unseen, unheard, until it was too late. It struck PT-109 midship, splitting it in two. Fire roared across the water. 2 men were killed instantly. Kennedy and the survivors clung to wreckage, adrift for hours before swimming miles to a deserted island. The loss was tragic, but the shock ran both ways. The Japanese had expected no resistance that deep into their lanes. American torpedo boats were supposed to be coastal defenders, not predators in open sea. Their growing presence forced Imperial commanders to change course. Literally, convoys were rerouted, timetables altered, and entire sectors reinforced against this unseen threat. Elsewhere that same month, PT Squadron 8 struck a Japanese barge convoy off New Georgia. Under Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, the boats attacked in moonlight so bright it was almost suicidal. They darted between destroyer escorts, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. 2 transports exploded, setting the sea ablaze. The surviving barges scattered. But the psychological blow was greater than the physical damage. In the Philippines, remnants of earlier PT squadrons had already written their legend. Back in March 1942, during the desperate retreat from Bataan, Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley's squadron, only 4 operational boats, had defied orders to withdraw. They attacked Japanese ships in Manila Bay, rescued trapped soldiers, and ferried messages under fire. When MacArthur needed evacuation from Corregidor, it was Bulkeley's PTs that carried him through a gauntlet of Japanese patrols to safety. The journey took 3 nights and over 500 miles. Engines failed. Fuel ran low. At one point, Bulkeley personally manned the gun when the crew was too exhausted to continue. When they finally reached Mindanao, MacArthur radioed his now famous vow, "I shall return." That promise, born on the deck of a PT boat, would echo through the rest of the Pacific War. By 1943, the torpedo squadrons were everywhere: Tulagi, New Guinea, the Bismarck Sea. Their most dramatic victories came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March that year. After Allied aircraft obliterated a Japanese troop convoy, surviving transports limped toward shore. PT boats raced in through the smoke, gunners firing into the wrecks. They finished what the bombers began, sinking rescue barges, cutting off survivors, and ensuring the Japanese reinforcements never reached New Guinea. Reports from Japanese survivors described the scene as chaos. Small black ships moving through fire, shooting at everything that floated. It was one of the first times fast attack boats had directly influenced a major campaign outcome. From then on, the Japanese treated them with new respect and fear. Convoys began moving only under heavy escort, often delaying crucial operations. Destroyers burned precious fuel chasing phantoms through narrow channels, while PTs slipped away into the reefs. Perhaps the most daring operation of all came in late 1944, when American PTs supported landings in the Philippines' Leyte Gulf. Operating close to enemy shores, they attacked troop barges and small transports evacuating Japanese personnel. The battles were short, violent, and personal. Crews could see the faces of their enemies in the flashes of gunfire. By then, the boats had evolved. Heavier guns, better radar, improved torpedoes. But their essence remained the same. Fragile hunters striking from the dark. Each engagement followed a rhythm. Stealth, strike, escape. But on certain nights, that rhythm broke. A misjudged turn, a jammed torpedo, a sudden flare, and the sea became hell. The men of the PTs lived minute to minute, each mission a coin toss between glory and oblivion. Through these battles, something larger emerged, not just the effectiveness of the boats, but their symbolism. They embodied the new kind of warfare America was learning to master. Fast, decentralized, unpredictable. And as the Pacific tide began to turn, these wooden ghosts played their part in every victory. Unseen, uncelebrated, but vital. By the end of 1943, Japan's convoys were bleeding. Their war machines still stretched across the Pacific. But the arteries were being cut, one by one. The real turning point was coming, and the Mosquito Fleet was about to face its greatest test yet. By early 1944, the Mosquito Fleet had become a ghostly menace that the Japanese could neither destroy nor ignore. Their destroyers and troop transports now traveled under blackout, zigzagging through narrow island channels to avoid ambush. But the Americans had learned the rhythm of those routes, and they used speed, radar, and nerve to shatter them. In the Battle of Surigao Strait, October 24–25, 1944, part of the massive Leyte Gulf operations, PT boats stood on the front line. Before the U.S. battleships even fired, it was the torpedo squadrons that made first contact with the advancing Japanese fleet. In the pre-dawn hours, PT Squadron 131 spotted enemy silhouettes, Admiral Nishimura's Southern Force, 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 4 destroyers, steaming toward the strait. Outgunned and outnumbered, the PTs were ordered to shadow, report, and strike if possible. They did more than that. As the Japanese fleet advanced in formation, PT-493 and PT-127 closed to within 4,000 yards, firing their torpedoes in quick succession. Fountains of water rose around the oncoming ships as shells screamed overhead. The Japanese fired star shells, lighting the water into ghostly silver, revealing the PTs darting and weaving like sparks in a storm. Minutes later, explosions echoed through the strait. One torpedo slammed into the destroyer Yamagumo, ripping open her bow. Another crippled Mikuma, forcing her to withdraw. Though several boats were damaged or lost, they had achieved the impossible. They had slowed an entire battleship column, forcing it into disarray. By dawn, Admiral Oldendorf's heavy ships were in position. What followed was the last classic battleship duel in history, but it was made possible by the PT's night-long delaying action. Without their sacrifice, the American line might never have formed in time. Farther north, PTs in Mindoro and Ormoc Bay waged their own war against Japanese reinforcements. Here, the combat was brutal and intimate. Barges and small transports hugged the coastline under cover of darkness. PTs crept in at full throttle, cutting through the shallows with torpedoes and cannon fire. On December 3, 1944, near Ormoc, PT-490 led an assault on a convoy protected by enemy destroyers. The Americans struck first, their torpedoes finding targets amid the chaos. As explosions lit the shoreline, Japanese return fire raked the boats. PT-490's deck gun was destroyed and several men were wounded, but they continued firing, refusing to break contact until the last transport sank. The Japanese Naval Command was stunned. These were supposed to be auxiliary craft, expendable Mosquito boats. Instead, they had become assassins of the imperial supply chain. To counter them, Japan deployed new anti-PT tactics: shore batteries, night patrol aircraft, and heavily armed barges designed specifically to withstand torpedo hits. But the Americans adapted faster. They replaced torpedoes with 37mm and 40mm autocannons, transforming their boats into floating gun platforms capable of tearing through wood and steel alike. Radar-guided ambushes became standard. And when Japanese barges began hiding in mangrove channels, PT crews went in after them, often within grenade range. By 1945, in the Philippines and Borneo campaigns, PT boats were operating as multi-role strike units, raiding, supply running, reconnaissance, even rescuing downed pilots and stranded soldiers. One squadron rescued over 150 airmen in a single month. Others transported OSS agents and guerrillas deep behind enemy lines, conducting sabotage and intelligence missions invisible to official records. To the Japanese, it seemed as if every shoreline now hid a torpedo boat, a ghost waiting for the right night. One Japanese commander called them the sea's gnats, impossible to swat, impossible to escape. The psychological effect was immense. Convoys delayed their sailings for hours, sometimes days, waiting for reports of PT movements to clear. That hesitation compounded across the Pacific front, slowing supply lines, starving garrisons, and isolating islands. But the toll on the American crews was heavy. Night after night, they operated on adrenaline and coffee, surrounded by darkness and the smell of gasoline. One wrong move could ignite their own fuel tanks. Many didn't survive long enough to see the war's end. Yet those who did would speak of the sea with reverence, and of the strange calm that came between battles. In one of the last actions of the war, PT boats patrolled Borneo's coast in August 1945, hunting the final Japanese troop barges still trying to flee. Then came word: the Emperor had surrendered. The same boats that once carried fire and destruction now carried peace messages to enemy outposts, still unaware the war was over. As their engines idled and the guns fell silent, crews looked out over the black water, the same water they had fought upon for years, and realized the truth. They had been the smallest combatants in the largest ocean, yet their impact had rippled across an empire. The Pacific War had turned. Japan's fleet was in ruins, its supply lines shattered, its command paralyzed. But behind those victories lay the quiet work of wooden boats, and the men who dared to sail them into hell. The sea was finally still, but its silence carried echoes of propellers, of gunfire, of courage. The aftermath of that silence would reveal just how deeply these small boats had altered the course of the Pacific War. When the Pacific finally fell silent in August 1945, the U.S. Navy's PT boats, those fragile wooden hunters, had written one of the most paradoxical chapters in maritime warfare. They were among the smallest combat vessels ever fielded, yet their impact rippled far beyond their tonnage or firepower. By war's end, U.S. Navy records credited the PT fleet with destroying or damaging over 600 Japanese vessels, including destroyers, transports, barges, and countless smaller craft. But those numbers, while impressive, only told part of the story. The true victory lay in the disruption they caused, the hours of lost movement, the fuel burned in evasive zigzags, the paralysis inflicted on an enemy that now feared the dark. Captured Japanese reports spoke volumes. One naval officer from the 8th Fleet wrote bitterly in 1944, "The enemy's small boats appear suddenly and strike without warning. They have no respect for weather or darkness. Our destroyers are forced to waste time and shells on targets that will not die. That psychological effect was deliberate. The PT boats were never meant to win through brute strength. They were designed to exhaust, confuse, and terrorize. For every torpedo they fired, a dozen Japanese convoys altered course or delayed departure. In the hyper-efficient machinery of wartime logistics, that hesitation was lethal. Japanese sailors began referring to them as devil boats, a name that captured both fear and respect. One survivor from a sunken transport off the coast of New Guinea recalled, "They came like insects. The sea erupted around us, and then they were gone." But the Americans paid dearly for that fear. Of the 531 PT boats built, 99 were lost to combat, accidents, or weather. Over 400 crewmen were killed, and many more were wounded or burned in gasoline fires that often turned the sea into flame. The boats' wooden hulls, designed for speed, could not withstand heavy gunfire. A single tracer round could ignite the deck fuel tanks. Still, morale remained astonishingly high. Reports from squadron commanders noted that volunteers continued to arrive, drawn by the combination of freedom, danger, and purpose that the PT service offered. Many sailors later described it as the closest thing to pirate warfare in the modern age. The psychological balance of the Pacific began to shift. Japanese destroyer captains, once confident of their dominance, now dreaded narrow passages and island channels. Convoy timetables, once precise, became erratic. The Imperial Navy issued new directives forbidding night movement without heavy escort, a logistical nightmare that crippled their supply efficiency. The PT's value wasn't just in combat, it was in presence. Their very possibility forced Japan to rethink its naval doctrine. In the Philippines campaign, intelligence intercepts revealed how Japanese ground units often refused to move along coastlines at night. Even the rumor of PT activity could immobilize troop transfers. American commanders understood the leverage this gave them and used it ruthlessly. PT squadrons were strategically dispersed across island groups, not to sink fleets, but to create fear corridors. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy analysts began to realize that these small boats had done something remarkable. They had inverted naval logic. For centuries, dominance at sea belonged to the largest guns and thickest armor. Now, speed and surprise had achieved the same result through psychology. The shift was subtle but profound. One intelligence summary from 1945 phrased it best. "The enemy no longer fights where we are. He fights where we might be." That simple line encapsulated the Mosquito Fleet's entire contribution. Their impact couldn't be measured only in tonnage sunk, but in time stolen and options denied. Yet for the sailors who lived it, the statistics meant little. They remembered the smell of gasoline and cordite, the salt burning their eyes, the sound of engines straining against the night. They remembered losing friends in flashes of flame and watching ships sink faster than they could mourn. They had fought not for headlines, but for survival and for each other. Still, when historians examined the Pacific campaign maps, a pattern emerged. Wherever the PTs had operated, Japanese control collapsed faster. From the Solomons to the Philippines, from New Guinea to Borneo. Every corridor they entered soon became a graveyard of barges and burning transports. The war was over, but its lessons were only beginning. The Mosquito Fleet had forced admirals to rethink the meaning of power at sea, and in doing so, had helped lay the foundation for a new age of naval warfare. In the years that followed, the lessons of the PT boat campaign spread far beyond the Pacific. What began as an experimental project, small, fast attack craft built of wood and hope, had transformed into a blueprint for modern naval thinking. The U.S. Navy's post-war analyses, compiled through 1946 to 47, emphasized one point above all: flexibility had defeated mass. A handful of small boats, operating with minimal command oversight, had achieved what entire fleets sometimes could not: persistent disruption of enemy movement. That revelation reshaped how the Navy approached littoral and coastal warfare for decades to come. From those reports came new doctrines: the foundation for fast patrol craft, swift boats, and later special operations platforms used in Korea and Vietnam. The PTs had proven that small units, operating independently, could create strategic leverage, disproportionate to their size. The Navy formalized this concept into a doctrine called distributed lethality, decades before the term would be reinvented in the 21st century. It meant spreading offensive capability across many small, mobile units rather than concentrating power in a few large ships. The echoes of the Mosquito Fleet could even be felt in the formation of the U.S. Navy SEALs. Many of the early SEAL instructors and boat operators traced their lineage directly back to PT and OSS maritime units of World War II. The idea of stealth insertion, night raids, and coastal sabotage, all born in the jungled waterways of the Pacific, evolved into modern special warfare. But the influence wasn't purely tactical. It was psychological. The PT boats had changed how enemies perceived American warfare. To the Japanese, the Americans had once seemed a lumbering industrial power. Vast factories and heavy ships. The torpedo boats shattered that stereotype. They showed that the U.S. could also fight small, fast, cunning, and improvisational. Their success also changed how the Navy trained its officers. Future captains studied PT tactics for lessons in initiative and decision-making. These men operated without heavy oversight, often relying only on instinct and limited radio communication. They embodied command at the edge, where judgment mattered more than rank. One Navy report summarized it simply: in the torpedo boats, a man either learned to think for himself or didn't live long enough to learn at all. That autonomy became a defining trait of U.S. naval culture in the Cold War. Technologically, too, the PT legacy endured. Their Packard V-12 engines, the same that powered aircraft, became a case study in cross-domain innovation. Their lightweight hulls inspired advances in fiberglass and aluminum boat design. And their radar systems, once experimental, paved the way for integrated navigation used on every modern warship. Even in enemy navies, the lessons were not lost. Post-war Japanese engineers studied American PT designs during Reconstruction under Allied supervision, noting how simplicity and speed could compensate for material scarcity. The Soviets, watching closely, developed their own line of fast torpedo boats, a direct descendant of the Pacific experience. Within a decade, the world's oceans swarmed with successors to the humble wooden boats that once haunted the South Pacific. Yet for all the technical progress, the human legacy was more profound. Veterans of the PT service formed close-knit associations that lasted their lifetimes. They met not to boast, but to remember. The smell of the engines, the terror of night runs, and the unspoken bond between men who faced death together in open water. John F. Kennedy's wartime experience on PT-109 became emblematic of that generation. When he entered politics, the story of his survival, his leadership, his refusal to abandon his crew, became part of America's post-war myth. Through him, the PT boats transcended their size and became symbols of courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice. In hindsight, historians would call them weapons of morale. They didn't win the war alone, but they reminded America that adaptability and spirit could overcome technological inferiority. In a conflict defined by massive fleets and atom bombs, they were proof that even small forces could tilt history's balance. By 1946, most of the surviving PT boats were burned or scrapped, their wooden hulls deemed obsolete. But as the flames consumed them on the beaches of Samar and Subic Bay, veterans gathered to watch. For them, it wasn't an end. It was a farewell to something that had defined their youth and courage. The smoke rose into a sky finally free of warplanes, and for the first time in years, the sea was quiet. From that silence emerged a new understanding of warfare, that speed, stealth, and human resolve could outweigh armor and size. The world would remember the PT boats not for what they destroyed, but for what they proved. The Pacific was vast beyond comprehension, a world of horizons and silence. Yet within that immensity, America's smallest ships carved out a legend of disproportionate power. The PT boats were never meant to dominate by force. They existed in the margins, the darkness between islands, the narrow channels where giants could not maneuver. In that darkness, they found their purpose. Their strength came not from armor or tonnage, but from nerve, invention, and the will of the men who crewed them. In their wake, they left a paradox that still defines modern warfare, that speed and adaptability can wound empires more deeply than brute strength. Every encounter with the enemy was a reminder that warfare had changed. From the grand spectacle of fleets to the intimate, nerve-shattering exchanges of men fighting within sight of one another's eyes. The legacy of those boats lived on long after the wood had burned away. Their spirit resurfaced in river patrols in Vietnam, in special operations that relied on stealth instead of scale, in the algorithms of modern drone fleets that now prowl oceans and skies unseen. The tools evolved: aluminum, radar, satellite. But the philosophy remained the same: strike fast, disappear faster, and never fight on the enemy's terms. And beneath every technological triumph lay a human truth. The men who rowed those boats knew fear intimately. They faced the sea not as conquerors, but as survivors. Their victories were measured not in medals or tonnage, but in endurance, in refusing to yield when logic said they should. In the end, the Mosquito Fleet taught the world something enduring: that innovation is not born from abundance, but from necessity, and that courage, when paired with imagination, can turn fragility into a weapon. The Empire of Japan learned that lesson the hard way, because in the vast Pacific, it wasn't the battleships or bombers that struck the first real blow to their naval pride. It was the smallest fleet America ever built, the secret fleet that shocked Japan.